A bitter wind sweeps across the frozen landscape of East Anglia, England. It is dawn on a morning in late February 1944. The darkness is absolute, broken only by the faint, ghostly glow of hooded lanterns moving like will-o'-the-wisps across a vast, flat expanse. This is an American bomber base, a temporary city of steel matting and canvas, home to the men of the United States 8th Air Force. In the frigid silence, you can hear the rustle of a mechanic's sheepskin jacket, the muted clang of a toolbox, the crunch of frost under a boot. Then a shout pierces the gloom. The ritual begins. One by one, massive radial engines cough, sputter, and then roar to life, a deep primordial growl that vibrates through the earth itself. Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, giants of aluminum and steel, awaken. For the young men inside those machines, the symphony of power is the overture to a journey into hell. The target lies deep in the heart of Adolf Hitler's fortress Europe. To reach it, they must run a gauntlet of flak and fighters more concentrated and deadly than any in human history. Their survival depends on Guardian Angels fighter pilots in swift, nimble escorts. But for years, those angels had wings of wax, doomed to fall away as they flew too close to the sun of German defenses. And the masters of those defenses, the veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jaguar, watched, waited, and calculated with cold precision. When a new, slender American fighter arrived on the scene in 1943, the North American P-51 Mustang, they assessed it with a dismissive, professional eye. To them, it looked almost delicate. It did not fit their doctrine of brute force or complex engineering. From cockpits of battle-scarred Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they laughed. It was the laughter of supreme confidence, born of years of aerial dominance and a deeply held belief in their own technical and martial superiority. German pilots laughed at the P-51 Mustang until it outran their Messerschmitts. This is not merely a story of an airplane outperforming another. It is the epic tale of a technological and psychological revolution fought at 30,000 feet. A revolution that shattered the Luftwaffe's iron grip on the skies of the Third Reich, turned hunters into the hunted, and changed the fundamental nature of the air war over Europe. It is a story of desperation, ingenuity, industrial might, and the moment a whisper of doubt grew into a roar of defeat in the minds of the world's most feared fighter pilots. To understand the seismic impact of the P-51 Mustang, we must first ascend into the cauldron of the early American daylight bombing campaign. Our protagonists are not just the fighter pilots, but the men of the heavy bomber crews, the boys who became old men before their time in the freezing, oxygen-thin altitudes over Europe. By late 1942, the strategic doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces was set in stone: the precision destruction of German war industry through unescorted daylight bombing. This was a creed of technological optimism and moral clarity, a belief that the Norden bombsight and the tight formations of the B-17 and B-24 could win through. The young men tasked with executing this doctrine came from every corner of America: college students, farmhands, mechanics, and accountants. They were condensed into 10-man crews, a microcosm of society sealed inside a trembling aluminum shell. They faced an opponent that was the antithesis of their own philosophy: a decentralized, adaptive, and brutally efficient integrated air defense system, the German Jaguar. This was not merely a collection of fighter planes. It was a living organism. It began with the Kammhuber line, a dense network of radar stations stretching from Denmark to France, each sector controlled by a JAG division. Ground controllers, veterans themselves, would vector interceptors Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds from IL-8. Jagdgeschwader like JG-26 Schlagerdar and JG-2, Richthofen towards the bomber streams with chilling efficiency. The German fighters employed layered, vicious tactics. The Bf 109 seconds, lighter and nimble, would engage the escort fighters. The heavier FW 190 seconds, armed with devastating 20mm and 30mm cannon, would form into Sturmgruppen and assault groups for head-on passes against the bomber boxes, aiming to destroy an aircraft with a single, concentrated burst. The American escorts available in 1942 and early 1943 were formidable but flawed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a flying tank, incredibly durable and well-armed, with 8 50 caliber machine guns. But its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was thirsty. Even with a newly introduced 75-gallon drop tank, its combat radius was perhaps 325 miles, enough to reach the German border, fight briefly, and return. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a revolutionary twin-engine design with excellent range and firepower, but it was complex, suffered from compressibility issues in dives, and its distinctive silhouette made it easy to identify and single out. Both fighters shared the same cruel limitation, the tyranny of distance. At a PI-determined point, usually along the Rhine or just beyond, the fighter group leader would receive the order or make the agonizing calculation himself. Fuel gauges dipping towards reserve, he would waggle his wings, and the entire escort would turn for home. For the bomber crews, the sight of those protective shapes disappearing into the haze was a physical blow. They called it the point of no return, or more grimly, the leave-taking. What followed was known as the happy time for the Luftwaffe and the death zone for the Americans. For 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours, the unescorted bombers were alone in a sky suddenly filled with swarming, predatory enemies. The psychological dynamic was set. The German pilot, especially the expert and with scores of dozens or even hundreds of kills, operated from a position of immense strength. He fought over his homeland, with short flight times to the combat zone, guided by a skilled ground controller, and often with the advantage of choosing when and where to strike a weakened foe. He viewed the American bomber crews with a mixture of respect for their courage and pity for their predicament. He viewed their escorts as temporary nuisances. This confidence bred a tangible arrogance. The Luftwaffe believed, with some justification, that they held both a tactical and a qualitative edge. Their aircraft were designed for the mission. The Bf-109, constantly refined, was a masterpiece of lightweight power. The FW-190, designed by Kurt Tank, was arguably the finest all-around fighter of the early war years. They could not conceive that the Americans, a nation of mass production, could produce a machine that could surpass their tailored engineering in performance and carry enough fuel to fight deep inside Germany. This was the entrenched, bloody stalemate into which the P-51 Mustang was born. The North American P-51 Mustang has a unique origin story, one that begins not with the US Army Air Corps but with the British. In 1940, desperate for fighters after the losses of the Battle of Britain, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40s under license. North American's President, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, boldly proposed they could design and build a better, newer fighter in the same time. The result, designed in a mere 117 days, was the NAS-73X, a sleek airframe featuring a revolutionary laminar flow wing that reduced drag. Powered by the American Allison V1710 engine, this early Mustang was a solid, low-altitude performer, excellent for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance. It entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1942. The Germans first encountered these Allison engine Mustangs over the Channel coast and in the skies of occupied France. To the pilots of JG-26, flying their high-altitude Bf-1096S and FW-190A6S, the engagement was puzzling. The Mustang was fast and handled well at medium levels, but above 15,000 feet, its performance fell off a cliff. The Allison engine lacked a high-altitude supercharger. In combat reports, German pilots noted the Mustang's pleasant lines but dismissed it as no threat in the arena that mattered: the thin, cold air above 20,000 feet, where the bomber war was decided. The laughter began here. It was a technical assessment, a pretty airplane, but not a proper high-altitude fighter. Meanwhile, in a hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, England, a brilliant British test pilot and engineer named Ronald Harker had a revolutionary idea. He had flown the Mustang I and was deeply impressed by its airframe, its smoothness, its low drag, its potential. Looking at it, he saw a beautiful chassis hampered by a weak engine. And sitting in British factories was the engine he envisioned, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. The Merlin, as fitted to the Spitfire 9, was a different beast from the early Merlins. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained phenomenal power output into the stratosphere. In October 1942, Harker penned a memo suggesting the marriage. It was an act of inspired improvisation. North American and Rolls-Royce engineers collaborated at a feverish pace. The airframe required modification, a new engine mount, a larger radiator to cool the more powerful engine, which serendipitously created the Mustang's iconic, aerodynamically efficient belly scoop, and a four-bladed propeller to harness the extra power. The first flight of the Mustang X, the Merlin Mustang prototype, took place on October 13, 1942. The results were nothing short of spectacular. The transformed aircraft could reach 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, outclimbing and outrunning the contemporary Spitfire 9, and on paper, every operational German fighter. Back in the United States, the USAAF took notice. They had initially shown little interest in the Mustang, but the British test data was irresistible. North American began production of the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang at its Inglewood, California plant. The first models arrived in England in late 1943. Assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group, as they would become known, was a new unit full of eager but untested pilots. Their commanding officer, Colonel Don Blakesley, a legendary fighter leader from the 4th Fighter Group flying Spitfires and then P-47s, saw the Mustang's potential immediately. But the aircraft still had a critical limitation: range. The internal fuel capacity was good, but not revolutionary. The breakthrough, once again, was deceptively simple. Engineers adapted the existing bomb shackles to carry streamlined 75 and later 110-gallon disposable fuel tanks made of pressed paper or lightweight metal. These drop tanks were the key that unlocked the Mustang's destiny. The strategic implication was now clear, yet its full impact remained to be proven in combat. The 8th Air Force, reeling from the horrific losses of the Second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, where 60 B-17s were lost and over 600 men were casualties, was at a crossroads. Daylight bombing was in crisis. The P-51B, with two 75-gallon wing tanks and a potential 110-gallon fuselage tank, could fly a combat mission of over 1,000 miles. It could fly to Berlin, fight over Berlin, and return. This was the answer to the prayers of every bomber commander, but the German High Command, particularly the General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, failed catastrophically to grasp what was coming. German intelligence, fixated on production numbers and traditional metrics, underestimated the significance of the external tanks. They saw the early P-51B operations as limited probes. Galland, a brilliant tactician, was hamstrung by Hitler's obsession with offensive revenge weapons and a constant drain of resources to other fronts. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy remained static, predicated on the old, comforting reality of short-legged escorts. The stage was thus set for a collision of perceptions. The Americans, with a revolutionary new tool, planned a massive, sustained offensive designed to pulverize the German fighter industry and draw the Luftwaffe into a battle of annihilation. They called it Argument, later known to history as Big Week, for the young pilots of the 354th FJ. Climbing into their new Mustangs in the freezing English dawn of February 20, 1944, the mission was clear: escort B-17s of the 1st Bomb Division to the distant target of Leipzig. They carried full drop tanks. They had briefed to take them all the way. In the cockpits of JG-11's Bf-109 seconds at Oldenburg scrambled to intercept the incoming stream. The expectation was business as usual. They would climb, observe, wait for the escorts to leave, and then attack. The tension was not in anticipation of a new threat, but in the routine of another intercept. Little did they know that the fundamental rules of their existence were about to be torn apart. By 1100 hours, the American Armada was crossing the Dutch coast. In the lead, bombers, waist gunners peered out at a seemingly endless sea of contrails. High above, the Mustangs of the 354th held station. The German radar plot was a solid mass of contacts. The JAG division controllers began their work, ordering squadrons to orbit at specific points to wait. The first tentative probes came from German fighters, small groups of Bf-109 seconds testing the escort's resolve. The Mustang pilots, under strict orders to conserve fuel and protect the bombers, held their discipline. They drove off the attacks, but did not pursue deeply. To the German pilots, this looked familiar, a defensive, conservative stance. The bomber stream droned on, deeper into Germany, past the Rhine, past the Ruhr. The flak began as sporadic, then constant, black thunderhead through which the fortresses had to fly. The tension aboard the bombers ratcheted up with every mile. They were past the old leave-taking point. And yet, when they scanned the high, crystal blue sky, they could still see the slender, contrailing shapes of the Mustangs. A novel, fragile hope began to stir. At T-1300 hours, approaching the initial point for the bomb run on Leipzig, the calculus changed. The German ground controllers, realizing the escorts were not leaving, made a fateful decision. They could wait no longer. They ordered all available Gruppen to attack. From airfields across central Germany, the last reserves scrambled. The sky began to fill with enemy fighters, not just the probing units, but the main four Sturmgruppen of FW-190 seconds lumbering into position for their head-on runs, escorted by Bf-109 seconds tasked with occupying the escorts. This was the moment of truth. Over the radio crackled the order from the 3-5-4-TH's group leader: drop tanks. Drop tanks now, across the formation. Pilots reached for the toggle switches. A series of distinct thuds reverberated through cockpits as the now empty aluminum and paper tanks ripped away, tumbling through the bomber formations below. Instantly unburdened, the P-51s transformed. The sleek airframes, now clean, leapt forward with newfound energy. The Guardians were shedding their chains. They were no longer just escorts. They were now free-hunting predators. What followed over the smoking, industrial landscape of Leipzig was a sprawling, chaotic, and brutal aerial battle on a scale never before seen. For every participant, the crisis manifested in a different, profound way. Inside the B-17 Lucky Lady, Technical Sergeant Frank Collar, a waist gunner from Chicago, experienced the crisis as a prolonged sensory overload of terror. The world narrowed to the rectangle of his gun port. The roar of the four engines was a constant, deafening baseline. The air temperature was 60 degrees below zero, and despite his electrically heated suit, the cold was a penetrating ache. The first sign of the main attack was not sight, but sound: the frantic, distorted voice of the tail gunner over the intercom. Bandits, 6 o'clock high. Many of them. Then he saw them. Not the familiar silhouettes of 109s, but the broader, more menacing shapes of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds in stacked formations, coming from the rear and slightly above. They were flying straight and level, ignoring the defensive fire from the bombers, a tactic of terrifying confidence. This was the Sturmgruppe. As they closed, the nose of each FW-190 seemed to sparkle with tiny, deadly flashes. A split second later, the B-17 around him was hammered by a storm of 20mm and 30mm cannon shells. The sound was unlike anything, a cacophony of tearing metal, exploding glass, and the sickening thwack of rounds hitting armor and flesh. The aircraft shuddered violently, an oxygen mask somewhere behind him. A A fuel line severed, spraying raw gasoline that instantly vaporized into a deadly mist. The crisis was immediate and existential. To put his gloved hands on the grips of his .50 caliber, to traverse the heavy weapon against the onrushing tide of enemy fighters, to try and place his traces into the path of a closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. All while his home, his 10-man family, was being systematically blasted apart around him. In the cockpit, the pilot and CO pilot fought to hold station in the formation, knowing that to stray was to die alone. The crisis was one of sheer endurance against an onslaught that seemed mathematically designed to exterminate them. For First Lieutenant Glenn Eggleston of the 354th Fighter Group, flying his P-51B Stinky, the crisis was one of overwhelming responsibility and tactical chaos. One moment he was in a neat four-ship flight, the next the sky dissolved into a swirling melee of aircraft. The orderly bomber boxes were below, surrounded by flashing, diving, burning shapes. His oxygen mask fogged with his own breath. His eyes stug from straining to see the grey-green camouflaged German fighters against the patchwork ground in the hard blue sky. A Bf 109 flashed across his canopy, a blur of black cross and yellow nose. He broke hard left, his body crushed into the seat by G-forces, his vision graying at the edges. He lost his wingman. The radio was a bedlam of shouts, "Brake right, I'm hit, there's one on your tail, Pinky 3. He had to fight the instinct to dive into the massive dogfight below. His primary mission was top cover to stay high, to keep the energy advantage, and to prevent the Germans from attacking from above. But seeing the bombers being savaged created an almost physical pull to dive in and help. The crisis was one of split-second decision-making in a three-dimensional chess game, where a mistake meant death, not just for him, but for the bomber crews he was sworn to protect. His Mustang was superior, but he was a novice, and he was facing men who had been fighting in the sky for 5 years, for Oberleutnant Hans-Heinrich Kohl of JG-11. The crisis was one of dawning, disorienting horror. He had led his swarm of 4 Bf-109G6s to the assigned altitude, expecting to find the usual pattern, a thinning escort, a concentrated bomber stream. Instead, he found a sky in turmoil. The bombers were there, but above them, not just a layer of escort, but multiple, roaming layers of those slender, fast new American fighters. He had never seen so many enemy fighters this deep in Germany. Before he could even position for an attack on a bomber, a warning scream came over his headset. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a pair of P-51s, their noses painted with bold, aggressive markings, already in a diving turn towards him. They were fast, alarmingly fast. He slammed the throttle forward, pushed the stick into a diving turn to build speed, but the Mustangs matched him effortlessly. The comfortable performance envelope of his 109 was gone. These Americans were not just defending, they were aggressively hunting him. He fired a short, futile burst at a Mustang that flashed past, seeing his traces fall far behind. For the first time in over 200 combat missions, Hans-Heinrich Kohl felt a pure, unadulterated fear not of death, but of tactical impotence. He was not in control. The hunter was now the prey. The carefully constructed ecosystem of the Jaguar, with its controlled interceptions and tactical advantages, was collapsing around him in real time. The laughter he and his comrades had shared weeks before now felt like a grotesque, distant memory. The crisis was ideological. The myth of German technical and tactical supremacy was evaporating in the cold, thin air at 28,000 feet. The turning point in the air war was not sealed on a single day over Leipzig, but big week February 20-25, 1944 was its undeniable, explosive proclamation. The P-51 Mustang proved it could do what was previously thought impossible, establish and maintain daylight air superiority deep over the Third Reich. The turning point was multifaceted: technical, tactical, industrial, and psychological. The technical turning point has been described: the Merlin engine and the drop tank. but its tactical application was what broke the Luftwaffe. The USAAF fighter commanders, men like General James H. Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th in January 1944, issued a revolutionary order. He freed the fighter escorts from their close, defensive tether to the bombers. His directive was simple and profound: destroy the enemy wherever you find him. The Mustang groups were now authorized, even ordered, to leave the bomber stream and go on the offensive. This led to the fighter sweep and the free hunt. Mustangs would now arrive over target areas ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies, or they would prowl the flanks, attacking German fighters as they formed up over their own airfields. The tactic of bouncing became commonplace, using their superior high-altitude performance. Mustang flights would stalk German formations from several thousand feet above, then dive with tremendous speed up, boom, fire a lethal burst from their 6 concentrated, 50-caliber guns, and then use that speed to climb back to safety. The zoom without engaging in a turning dogfight. The P-51's coolest technical advantage, its laminar flowing, gave it a much higher critical Mach number than the Bf 109, meaning it could dive faster and more safely. German pilots, used to being the masters of the diving attack, now found themselves unable to escape. The industrial turning point was the sheer, overwhelming volume of American production. While German fighter output actually peaked in 1944, it was a frantic, dispersed effort under constant bombardment. The American output of P-51s, however, was a flood. North Americans' plants in Inglewood and Dallas produced over 14,000 Mustangs of all types. A German pilot might shoot down a Mustang one day and face 2 more the next, flown by pilots whose training, while shorter, was now conducted in an environment where they faced a depleted, desperate enemy. The logistical abundance represented by the jettisoned drop tank was a constant, demoralizing symbol. German pilots fought with acute fuel shortages, their training crippled by lack of gasoline, their tactics constrained by strict fuel allotments. The sight of an American fighter casually discarding hundreds of gallons of fuel to better fight them was a psychological blow that underscored the vast, yawning chasm in the war of production. The psychological turning point was the most devastating. The expert in, the institutional memory and lethal cutting edge of the Jaguar began to perish at an unsustainable rate. In the first 6 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 2,500 pilots killed or missing. These were not just numbers. They were men like Major Walter Nautney, 258 kills, killed in November 1944, and the irreplaceable Oberstleutnant Gunter Eltzow, 110 kills, lost in 1945. The novice pilot replacing them, flying a fuel-starved, often technically inferior late war model like the Bf 109 G10 or K4 with cumbersome armament, stood little chance against a confident Mustang pilot with 400 hours of flight time. The Luftwaffe's morale, once its greatest asset, began to rot from within. A sense of futility set in. Pilots spoke of gelatin fighter pilots' Latin excuses and exaggerations to cover the grim reality. They gave the Mustang grudgingly respectful nicknames like Dear Berlin Express or simply Die Gefahr, the danger. A pivotal, symbolic moment of this turning point occurred not with an ace, but with a lone, determined pilot. On January 11, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Howard, a former Flying Tiger flying a P-51B with the 354th FG, was escorting B-17s to Oschersleben, spotting a large formation of German fighters preparing to attack the bomber box. Howard dove into them alone. In a 30-minute, single-handed engagement, he broke up attack after attack, claiming 6 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged. For his conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it. Howard's actions were more than heroic. They were a microcosm of the Mustang's impact. One pilot in one superior aircraft could disrupt the enemy's entire tactical plan. The initiative had irrevocably passed to the Americans. The resolution of the duel between the Mustang and the Messerschmitt was absolute and had cascading effects that led directly to Allied victory in Europe. The data provides the final, unassailable verdict. Before the full deployment of the long-range P-51, bomber loss rates could reach 20% on catastrophic days. After its ascendancy, loss rates fell to an average of 2-3, a sustainable level. The Luftwaffe's own loss rates became apocalyptic. In just the 4 months from May to August 1944, over 1,000 German fighter pilots were killed each month. The sky was swept clean. This air superiority, won by the Mustang and its stablemates like the late model P-47N and P-38J, was the prerequisite for every subsequent Allied operation. It made the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944 possible. On that day, the Luftwaffe managed barely 100 sorties over the beaches, while the Allies flew over 13,000. The Mustang's dominance enabled the transportation plan, the systematic destruction of French rail networks that paralyzed German reinforcements. It allowed fighter bombers, often Mustangs themselves, in the later ground attack role to roam virtually unopposed, strafing and bombing troop columns, tanks, and fuel depots in the run-up to and during the Battle of the Bulge. The human cost was monumental and must be remembered. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps in the war, over 26,000 killed. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war, and over 18,000 wounded. The fighter groups paid their price too. The 354th FG, for example, lost 170 pilots killed, missing, or captured during its service. Each loss was a universe of potential extinguished, but their sacrifice paved a highway in the sky, a highway that led to the liberation of a continent. The Mustang's legacy is enshrined in both statistics and sentiment. It is widely regarded as the finest all-around piston-engine fighter of World War II. It claimed over 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air in Europe, the highest total of any USAAF fighter. It produced a pantheon of aces: George Preddy, John Meyer, Don Gentile, Bud Anderson, and many more. But beyond the numbers, the P-51 Mustang represents the triumph of a specific kind of power, the power of free societies to innovate rapidly, to produce limitlessly, and to adapt ruthlessly. It was not a secret weapon. It was an open, gleaming declaration, written in aluminum and contrails across the sky of Fortress Europe. It silenced the laughter of the Jaguar, not with mockery, but with the relentless, deafening, and undeniable roar of its Merlin engine and the final, authoritative argument of its guns. This was the story of how a plane born from a British request became the sword that cut through the Luftwaffe's shield. How a whisper of innovation became a thunderclap of strategic change. It is a tale of engineering genius, of tactical evolution, of industrial abundance, and of the young men from Kansas and California who took this magnificent machine into the heart of the enemy's domain and mastered the sky. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Mystery as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.